We had been married less than a year when my husband died. The day after his funeral, I lost a pregnancy. I was 30, in storms of grief. Our house was beautiful. I had servants and money, gowns by Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli, a villa in the countryside, a yacht. Without Paolo, it counted for nothing. When war came, I volunteered in the ambulance corps as a driver. Without that, I would have gone mad. The irregular hours were a cover for the fact that I wasn't sleeping. There was no fire towards which I wouldn't drive. If you know Rome in high summertime, the weeks leading up to Ferragosto, I don't need to explain the vampiric, exhausting heat. My house on Via Viterbi, built around a Quattrocento courtyard, had a fountain and a colonnade in which bleary peacocks sulked. But I couldn't abide the courtyard. Young and jealous as I was, for it had been remodelled by a former lover of Paolo's, a girl who had left him, rather too glamorously, I felt, to become a nun and go to China on the missions. Instead, on those scourging afternoons of heat, when most of Rome goes to a cafe or to bed in a shuttered room, I would cycle to the gardens of the Villa Borghese and lie in the grass between the pines. The heat would coax loamy musk from the earth. I felt close to Paolo then. It was though I could hear his whisper. There was no need to bring a bundle of his love letters with me. In truth, I knew every one of them by heart, blushed into my memory as pomegranate juice tinctures Prosecco in the cocktail we shared on the terrazza before retiring on our wedding night. Those gardens were where Paolo and I had met, on an autumn day in 1936. I was walking with my sister when a blazingly handsome soldier approached, pushing a wheelchair in which was a blanketed old gentleman, his father. My sister asked them for directions to a particular cafe. A concert we wished to attend was to take place there, for we were lost and had been going in slightly argumentative circles, as sisters sometimes like to do. His eyes had a fierce gentleness, if such a contradiction is possible, and his manner such gallantry and what I can only call acumen. But enough of happier days. On those afternoons of my raw widowhood, when I would go again to the Villa Borghese gardens to weep on a park bench with his absence and the sirocco, I would sometimes, after an hour or two, go into the Galleria to wash my face or to look at the beautiful things. On a hot afternoon, the great rooms were often empty, lending the statues a pleasing sadness in that particular redolence of old heated dust that for me will always be Rome. Or a couple of students might be sketching them. A tousled boy, a smoking girl. I found envying their youth a healing heartache. One Thursday, I think it was, as I entered the Sala Bernini, the only person there was a priest. A tall, high-coloured man in wire-rimmed spectacles. He was clad in a long black cassock that must have been making him broil. His face was red as the monsignorial sash he wore, and his thick black hair looked damp. He was looking at that masterpiece of statuary, Apollo and Daphne, which Paolo had always loved, and often bribed the attendants to be allowed to photograph. Obviously, one sees priests every day in Rome, but something about him took my attention. He was not a particularly striking person to look at. Perhaps it was simply that he appeared hot and uncomfortable, or that seeing a priest in an art gallery is for some reason not all that common, or that his evident joy in admiring the statues was pleasing. Anyhow, he glanced towards me and smiled. "Did you ever in your life see anything so beautiful?" he said, in good, very formal Italian. "If one lived 1,000,000 years and had lessons from a master every day, one could never do a single iota of that. Imagine. It was once a block of stone in a quarry. Vero, I agreed. È bellissima. The detail is exquisite. One would swear they're alive. I have sometimes seen them move and breathe, I said. If you watch for an hour, that happens. Or when you enter the room very suddenly. With a look of joyous bafflement, he indicated the most miraculous detail of the piece, where the fingers of the god's left hand touched Daphne's flesh. Miraculous, he said. One doubts one's own eyes. Such softness could not be marble. Shaking his head as though in disbelief, he then turned to me again. Madame is French? He asked amiably. Sono italiana, I said. Forgive me, signora, I misheard your accent. My family are Parisian on my mother's side, I told him. My sister and I went to school in Nantes. The Oblate Franciscans, I'm guessing. Excellent ladies. Your guess is correct. Very good. By now, we seemed to have steered ourselves into the sort of conversational blind alley that often, among the newly met, preludes a departure. But, oddly, I didn't want him to go. Equally oddly, I felt he knew that. Are you Irish? I asked. Sì, sono irlandese. Have you lived in Rome long? Do you like it? I studied here as a young seminarian and returned a few years ago. I like it very much. But then, who wouldn't like it? May I talk with you, Father? I blurted. Suddenly I was weeping. He did not look at all surprised. It was as though he had been waiting for my tears. What I can only describe as a sort of fit assailed me. I had a feeling that I was drowning, and it frightened me. I remember a woman attendant hurrying in, but then leaving the room just as quickly, perhaps to seek help. The old hot dust stung my eyes. Signora, he said gently, with intense respectfulness and grace. Of course. Shall we walk a while outside? In the garden, I was unable to speak for a time. He cooled a handkerchief in a fountain and gave it to me silently, then led me towards a heavy stone bench under cherry laurels. A minute or two passed before my weeping fit subsided a little. A minute or two that must have had their difficulties for him, heaven knows. More than one passer-by had glanced with what the English call dagger eyes in our direction, as though my tears had been caused by their consoler. You are young to be so troubled, he said. I am sorry you're in pain. It came into the room with you, like music. My voice would not come, only bitter, anguished sobs. I realised I was tearing his handkerchief. Try to believe me, Signora, that your burden will pass. I fear it won't. In time. You don't even know what it is, and you speak to me of time. That's true. È vero. Forgive my presumption. It seems to me that there is only one thing that causes us such pain. To lose someone dear to us. Too soon. Why? I wept. I don't know, he replied. Why don't you know? I don't know that either. There was a pause before he added, It's not given to us to know. There are those that would say, to share the crucifixion is a great blessing. It is also to share the resurrection. Enough, I retorted. Don't tell me such lies. He nodded and gazed about. We need not talk at all if you wish. I can sit with you here. Perhaps you would hear my confession, I said. At this request, he looked surprised, but without delay he agreed, turning from me, closing his eyes and murmuring the words in Latin. I noticed that he had taken a set of rosary beads from his pocket and was holding them as he listened to what I said. A priest may never reveal what is said in confession, but of course a penitent may. I had never killed anyone, nor, I hope, had I ever sinned against the most important of all commandments, for me, in some ways, the only important commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. My transgressions against the other edicts, which seemed to forbid everything from loneliness to human nature, I listed as thoroughly as I could. And there was one great sin that had me in its grip in those days. The high prince of sins. Despair. Despair, in his diamonds of ice and grief, his robes of shimmering mist. In his eyes, the strange light that draws ships to the rocks. In his mourning, 10,000 choirs. You may gamble a hand with him, but the cards are all marked. He knows he will win at the close. What he's offering is opium, but many times stronger. There is nothing quite as comforting as perfect despair. And you don't understand that hope, if it is ever encountered, is in the small things of the everyday. Not an announcement from on high. In the aroma of cooking. A phrase from Vivaldi. A hand clasp. A conversation. This is what happened in the gardens of the Villa Borghese that day. Hope was waiting in the Sala Bernini. Entering the park, I didn't know him. Leaving it, I had shaken hands with the greatest friend of my life. I had never met anyone like him and never would again. Rompere gli schemi, we say in Italian. To break the mould.